It all starts with an arrest, a simple misunderstanding, or so they thought. But no one anticipated that this elderly black man, a quiet figure from a forgotten era, was about to unravel the entire narrative they'd set for him. As the cold handcuffs click shut, the officers don't see the layers of history wrapped around his life. They don't know his name, or the sacrifices he made, or the weight of the memories he carries. They just see an old black man walking alone down a city street, and to them, that's enough. What they don't realize, what they can't possibly fathom, is that 30 minutes from now, they'll regret every single decision they've made. And when the FBI comes to the station, it's too late to undo the damage. The story of prejudice is only beginning. It's a sunny afternoon, the kind that makes you think the world is just a little bit better. But not for Marcus Reynolds. The 68-year-old veteran is walking down a street in his old neighborhood, the same one he grew up in, where he fought for a country that didn't always appreciate his service. He has nothing on him, no weapons, no ill intentions. Just a man taking a walk on a bright day. But to two young officers, something about him feels wrong. Maybe it's the way he carries himself, straight-backed, unbothered, like he's seen things that would break others. Maybe it's the fact that he's a black man, aged but dignified, in a neighborhood where his kind doesn't belong anymore. Whatever it is, it's enough to make them stop him, ask questions, demand answers that don't exist. "Can I help you, officer?" Marcus asks politely, hands raised slightly as if in peace. The officers exchange glances, their instincts telling them to act first, ask questions later. They don't know his story. They don't care to know it. "You're under arrest," the officer snaps. "For what?" Marcus responds, his voice calm, though the unfairness of it stings deep inside. "You're being detained for questioning. Move." There's no reason, no explanation, just the snap of authority. And just like that, Marcus is handcuffed. The walk he was supposed to enjoy turns into a march toward injustice. Inside the holding cell, Marcus is left alone. No questions, no answers. He can hear the officers outside discussing what to do next. There's no rush. After all, the paperwork will take time, and it's not like anyone important is waiting for him. But as the hours tick by, Marcus's mind is elsewhere. He's thinking about the things he's seen, the battles fought in faraway lands, the ones that haunted his sleep for years. He thinks about his family, about how they must be wondering where he is. He thinks about how every step of his life led to this moment, a moment where his value is determined by the color of his skin, not by the heart and soul he's poured into this country. But just as he's beginning to wonder if anyone will ever see him for who he really is, something shifts. One officer walks in new to the scene. The others are busy elsewhere, laughing about their plans for the weekend, oblivious to the significance of what's happening right under their noses. The officer doesn't say a word as he looks at Marcus. He simply leans in close, lowering his voice. "We shouldn't have brought you in, old man," the officer whispers. "But it's too late now." Marcus doesn't respond. He's been here before in battles of words and of power. He knows when it's time to stay silent. And then, as if summoned by fate itself, the door flies open. A man in a sharp suit steps inside, flanked by two others who wear the same expression. Authority with a hint of urgency. "Where is he?" the man in the suit demands, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. The officers scramble, confused by the sudden intrusion, but one of them quickly points to Marcus. The suit-wearing man looks at him for a second, his eyes narrowing as if trying to read something invisible. "I'm here for Mr. Marcus Reynolds," the man says, now looking directly at the officers. "Release him, now." The officers exchange confused glances. This is not the kind of person they are used to seeing come through these doors. The man in the suit steps forward, never breaking eye contact with Marcus. The officers still don't fully understand what's happening, but it's clear that they've lost control of the situation. The room seems to close in on them, and for a moment, even the air feels different. What they don't know is that Marcus isn't just some random old man. They are about to find out exactly who he is. Marcus stands slowly, still in handcuffs, but there's something different in his posture now. There's no defeat in his stance, only quiet dignity. The man in the suit looks back at the officers, his tone ice cold. This is not just any man. This is a veteran who fought for this country. He served in Vietnam. He's seen more than you ever will. He's not your average suspect. Do you understand that? The officers begin to realize that they've made a grave mistake. But it's too late to undo it. The damage has been done. And then it happens. The phone rings. The man in the suit answers, and his face goes pale as he listens intently. A moment of silence passes before he speaks again. His voice now laced with disbelief. I need you to come in. Immediately. Minutes later, the door to the station swings open again. The FBI agents, all business, step inside with an intensity that sends a ripple of panic through the room. The air shifts once again, thick with an unease that is palpable. The suit-wearing man steps aside, letting them through. He speaks briefly with the lead agent, his voice low. Then, without warning, the agents turn to the officers, their expressions stern. You've just made a massive mistake, one agent says. The officers are bewildered. What do you mean? One asks, trying to sound confident despite the tension. The agent looks at Marcus and then back at them, shaking his head in disbelief. You arrested a man who has been a protected federal witness for years. Do you have any idea who you've been detaining? The room is dead silent, except for the subtle clink of metal as Marcus's handcuffs are released. He doesn't move, but a flicker of something regret, maybe, crosses the officers' faces. The agent continues, this is a high-priority case, and you've just jeopardized everything. Do you even realize the weight of your actions? The FBI agents gather around Marcus, their presence more commanding than the officers could ever be. There's a finality to the moment, but Marcus stands there with the quiet resolve of someone who has already faced the worst. He's been underestimated for too long. Now, the truth is about to come to light, and the consequences of their prejudice are about to unfold. But before anyone can speak again, the phone rings a second time. The agent answers, and his face shifts from frustration to something else, something darker. We need to talk. It's about the incident in the courtroom last week. The tension in the room explodes. And with that, the screen fades to black. What happens next? What did the FBI agent discover about Marcus that the officers couldn't see? Marcus Reynolds stood there, still feeling the burn of the handcuffs on his wrists, staring at the agents who had just walked into the room. He'd been arrested, dragged through the system, but what they hadn't realized was that he wasn't just any man. He wasn't a statistic to be disregarded, nor a stereotype to be locked away. He was a former soldier, a witness in an ongoing investigation that could bring everything crashing down for the people who thought they were above reproach. But what had just happened? The phone call, the agent's warning. It wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The phone call had just thrown everything into chaos. As the FBI agent turned to speak to the others, his voice was low but unmistakably urgent. Marcus could feel the weight of the room shift. What they didn't know, what they still didn't understand, was how deep this went. We need to move. Now, the agent said sharply. He looked directly at Marcus. You're a key figure in a federal case against people who have been exploiting their power for decades. We've been trying to find the right moment to move, and now we've got a hell of a complication. The officers stared in disbelief. One of them finally spoke up, trying to assert his authority. This is crazy, he muttered. What's he involved in? The agent's eyes narrowed, his patience visibly thinning. It's not for you to know. All you need to understand is that Marcus Reynolds is not your average citizen. He's not the criminal you thought he was. Marcus stayed quiet, his jaw clenched. They thought they could break him, humiliate him, make him just another nameless face in the system. But they had underestimated him. They had underestimated the depth of his knowledge, his quiet resilience. And they'd certainly underestimated the power of his story. The air was thick, as if the walls of the station itself were closing in on the officers. The FBI agents surrounded Marcus, their presence enough to make the officers squirm, but not enough to erase the simmering discomfort. They were still grappling with the weight of their mistake, unsure how to untangle themselves from the web they had just walked into. I need you to understand something, the agent continued, his voice firm. Your arrest of Marcus Reynolds wasn't just a wrong move. It was a critical mistake. And now we're going to fix it. But let's not pretend we're just dealing with a misunderstanding. You're about to find out what real consequences look like. One of the officers, younger and less confident, shuffled uncomfortably. He had been the one to put Marcus in handcuffs. He seemed to realize too late that his decision had just spiraled into something much bigger than he could handle. Marcus felt a sense of satisfaction but no joy. They had to be held accountable, but there was more at stake now. Much more. The investigation is bigger than you think, the agent said, stepping closer to Marcus, finally giving him the respect he had deserved all along. And the people involved, the ones you've been wrongly accused of being connected to, have held power for far too long. They've manipulated the system, created false narratives to protect themselves. But we're not going to let them win. Not this time. Marcus nodded slowly. What's the plan? The agent hesitated for a second, as if weighing whether to let him in on the next part. We need to move fast. You're a critical witness to what they've been doing behind the scenes. And they don't know you're still alive. They think they've erased you from the picture. But we know the truth, Marcus. And we're going to make sure everyone else does, too. Marcus inhaled deeply, as if the weight of everything had just hit him all at once. The tension that had been building in his chest was now spilling over. Then let's make sure they don't get away with it. The FBI agents moved quickly, clearing out the officers with cold efficiency. Within minutes, the holding room was empty, save for Marcus and the agents. But Marcus didn't have time to savor the moment. He knew this was just the beginning of the battle he had to fight. The agent leading the operation, who had introduced himself as Special Agent Carter, gestured for Marcus to follow him down the hallway. They didn't speak, but the silence was heavy with the weight of what was to come. They reached a small, dimly lit room. The door closed behind them with a final click. Okay, Marcus, Agent Carter began, leaning over a table stacked with files. This is where things get complicated. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Complicated. He had been through worse, seen more than his fair share of things that didn't make sense. But this felt different. How? There's a narrative about you, one that's been carefully constructed over the years. People want you to stay quiet, to just fade away. But we're not letting that happen. Marcus took a seat, studying the papers in front of him. And what's that got to do with me? You've been a key witness to their operations for decades, Carter continued. You've seen things that go all the way to the top. These are powerful people, Marcus. They've been running this city, this country, from the shadows. The realization hit Marcus like a hammer. He had always known there were forces at work that he couldn't touch. But this was different. It wasn't just a matter of race or class. It was a system built to keep people like him from ever being seen, from ever speaking the truth. They thought you were dead, Agent Carter continued. They thought they'd buried you. But we have your statement, your testimony, and we're going to take them down. As the conversation continued, Marcus felt the pressure mounting. He wasn't just fighting for his own freedom anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been silenced, oppressed, and forgotten. He had the chance to do something that mattered, to make sure that, this time, the truth wouldn't be buried. But there were still obstacles. The system wasn't going to just let him walk away. Not without a fight. Just as Marcus thought they were on the same page, the door to the room slammed open. The sound was deafening. It was one of the officers. The same officer who had arrested him. You're making a huge mistake, he said, voice dripping with menace. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. You think you can just waltz in here and turn everything upside down. Agent Carter immediately stepped forward, his hand hovering near his holster. What are you doing here? The officer smirked, clearly enjoying the chaos he was about to cause. You think you can take down the people behind this? You think you know everything? You don't. You're not even close. The agent stepped in front of Marcus, a protective stance. Leave now, before I make this worse for you. But the officer didn't back down. You've been playing a dangerous game, and you don't even know it. Marcus' heart raced. The tension was unbearable. Just as the officer reached into his pocket, pulling out a small, unmarked envelope. He dropped it on the table in front of Marcus. "Don't trust them," the officer hissed, before quickly exiting the room, leaving Marcus and Agent Carter in stunned silence. What was in the envelope? What did the officer mean by his cryptic words? Marcus looked down at the envelope, the answers lying just beyond his reach. As the tension in the room reached its boiling point, the screen cuts to black. The envelope lay on the table, untouched. Marcus Reynolds stared at it with a quiet intensity, his mind spinning. The officer had come and gone, leaving only the cryptic message, "Don't trust them." It was a warning, but a warning of what? Agent Carter had stepped aside, silent, as Marcus reached for the envelope. His fingers brushed the paper, and for a second he hesitated. Could this be a trap? Was this just another twist in a game that had already made him a pawn? The tension was unbearable. Whatever lay inside this envelope, whatever truth it held, could either be his salvation or his destruction. The weight of history pressed down on him. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore. It was about something much bigger, exposing the system of oppression that had kept him and so many others silenced for far too long. Marcus unfolded the envelope slowly, his breath steady but his heart racing. Inside was a single piece of paper, old and worn at the edges. On it was a handwritten note, scrawled in ink that looked almost faded, as if it had been passed from hand to hand for years. "You're not the only one who's been wronged. You know who I am. I know who you are. Stay silent and they win. Speak out and we'll all fall." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about him. Whoever wrote this had been keeping track of him, watching him for years. They knew about his past, about his service, about everything that had led him to this moment. But there was a deeper implication here. Someone else was involved, someone who understood the system of injustice as well as Marcus did, and someone who had already decided that silence was no longer an option. "I don't like where this is going," Agent Carter said, his voice cold. "Marcus, we need to act fast. This is bigger than you think. They're watching us." Marcus looked up, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had a choice to make. He could stay quiet, keep his head down, and hope this all blew over. But he knew that wasn't who he was. This was his chance to expose the system that had oppressed him and so many others for decades. This was his fight, and he wasn't going to run from it. "I'm not staying quiet," Marcus said, his voice steady but firm. "Not anymore." The plan was simple: go public. Marcus would tell his story, share the truth, and expose the system that had tried to bury him. But as he made that decision, he began to realize just how dangerous that choice was. He wasn't just taking on corrupt officers or government officials, he was taking on an entire system designed to keep people like him down. The more he dug into the envelope's cryptic message, the more he realized that his story was only one small piece of a much larger puzzle. Whoever had written that note was right, he wasn't alone. The people who had wronged him had wronged countless others, and their power was rooted in decades of manipulation and deceit. Marcus needed allies. People who had been through the same fight, people who had seen the same prejudice, the same systemic bias, and who were ready to stand up and speak out. He reached out to others, veterans who had been overlooked, activists who had fought for justice, and journalists who had a history of exposing corruption. But not everyone was eager to join him. Some were too afraid. The risk was too great. They had seen what happened to people who tried to stand up before. They had seen how the system swallowed them whole. "It's too dangerous, Marcus," one veteran told him. "You think you're the first to try and take them on? You won't win. They'll make sure of it." But Marcus wouldn't back down. He knew that if he didn't fight now, the system would continue to grind people like him into the dirt. He had seen too much, experienced too much to remain silent. So he pushed forward, building a coalition of people who believed in justice and in the power of truth. Together, they would challenge the system no matter how deep the corruption ran. As Marcus and his allies began to expose the corruption, they were met with fierce resistance. False narratives were spread. The media, controlled by powerful interests, began to smear his name. The same officers who had arrested him were now making the rounds, telling their version of events, twisting the truth. painting Marcus as a criminal, a threat to the system. But the lies only fueled his determination. He knew the truth was on his side. And now, more than ever, he had to make sure the world knew it too. The system pushed back hard. Marcus's phone lines were tapped. His allies were harassed. His every move was watched. But the more they tried to silence him, the louder he spoke. He gave interviews, wrote articles, and appeared on television. With every word he spoke, more people began to listen. More people began to understand that the story they'd been told was a lie, that prejudice wasn't just a thing of the past. It was alive and well, embedded in the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. Then came the day Marcus realized just how far the opposition was willing to go. It happened late one night, just as Marcus was about to leave his office. The sound of footsteps outside the door made him freeze. He wasn't alone. The door burst open, and two men in suits stepped inside, familiar faces from the department. One was the officer who had arrested him, the same one who had warned him to stay silent. The other was a man with an icy expression, someone who carried an air of authority and intimidation. "Marcus," the officer said, his voice low and dangerous, "you've made a lot of noise, but you don't understand the game you're playing. You're out of your depth, and now you need to stop." Marcus stood his ground, his eyes unwavering. "You think you can intimidate me? You've already arrested me once. What's stopping me from going public again?" The man with the icy expression stepped forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "You don't get it. You're not in control. We own this city. We own the media. We own everything. You're just a pawn, Marcus. And pawns get removed." Fear crept into Marcus's mind, but he didn't show it. He had been fighting for his dignity his whole life. He wasn't about to stop now. "You don't control me anymore," Marcus said, his voice rising with defiance. "I'm not afraid of you." The man chuckled, his laugh cold and bitter. "We'll see how long that lasts." As they left, Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. The stakes had just gotten higher, but now there was no turning back. He had made his decision, and he would see it through no matter what the cost. The next day, the world changed. The FBI, once hesitant, now backed Marcus's claims. Their investigation into the corruption that had been festering for years gained momentum. Whistleblowers came forward, their testimonies damning the very people who had tried to bury Marcus. The media, now forced to report the truth, turned the tide in his favor. But Marcus knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every person who had been wronged, every individual who had been silenced by the system. And as the investigation grew, more and more people began to speak up, sharing their stories, exposing the deep-seated racism and bias that had shaped their lives. Finally, the day came when the news broke. High-ranking officials had been arrested. The officers who had wronged Marcus were taken into custody. The system that had oppressed him and countless others was being dismantled piece by piece. Marcus stood outside the courthouse, the wind blowing through his hair. It was over. The justice he had fought for was finally within reach. But there was no sense of triumph in his heart. Instead, there was peace. He had faced down prejudice, fought against the system, and emerged victorious. But the battle wasn't over. There was still work to be done. There were still voices to be heard, still injustices to be righted. As Marcus turned and walked away from the courthouse, the weight of his journey lifted. He had exposed the truth. He had won. But more importantly, he had broken free from the chains of prejudice that had tried to hold him down. Join us in continuing to break the chains of prejudice. Subscribe for more stories that challenge the status quo and inspire change. The fight for justice is just one click away.